there are a few people in the California High School Speech Association that have contributed enormously to its history. And unfortunately this year I hear we're going to lose one of those most important members, and that's Larry Smith from Hoover High School in Fresno, who is a member of the California High School Speech Association Hall of Fame and a constant contributor to education, speech education in California. And so Larry, I would like to have you share some of your life in speech and some of the things that you've done with speech people in California. First of all, where did you go to high school?
Well, I'm in Nebraska. Farm boy type out in the wilds, western Nebraska I grew up. So I have really two, maybe three great passions in my life. One has been Cornhusker football. The other, of course, my lovely wife Judy of 40 years. And we're never sure which order those come around fall. And then the teaching and coaching of classes.
When you were in high school, did you do any competing?
No, they didn't. They never heard of any competitive speech back then. I had a speech class, which I truly liked. Probably was influential in my future choice of profession. I acted in the school plays, bad as they were, but there, in western Nebraska, there wasn't much in the way of culture and art. Although I will say that my little town of Chadron, Nebraska, had its first NFL chapter grant about 4 years ago when they got a little teacher there, and I worked with her one time when I was back there for a week in the summer, and she qualified a student to the national final tournament last year in oratory, so at least they have something back there now.
Oh, I'm glad you said an oratory, because for those that don't know Larry's record in oratory is somewhat phenomenal over the years. Then you went on to college. Where?
Well, I actually went a half a year, not real successfully, at college almost 2 blocks from my house, a little state teachers college back there, and then United States military wanted my services for 2 years, and then I came back, and I was married by that time, and I started college back in western Nebraska, but there weren't too many employment opportunities. When you're married, you can't live at home and sponge off your folks. So at the conclusion of that year, in 1957, my wife and I just packed everything we owned in the back of my little Ford convertible and drove to California, and I ended up in Fresno, going to Fresno State College, and graduated from there, MA from there, teaching credential from major. Well, I was a theater major and speech and English minor.
Now, I have to ask you this question because when you say a theater major, and we know that you have been in competition over the years, very strong in debate and very strong in oratory and extemp, what switched you to those events?
Well, when I first started teaching, I did teach theater. I taught drama for 2 years, and I enjoyed it, but I didn't enjoy it as much as I probably should have. It was never really an exciting experience. Most of the work that I did in the theater department at Fresno State was all technical theater, lighting, sound, stagecraft, stage building. And I enjoyed directing the shows, but I just was never satisfied with high school performances and that kind of thing. And I began to focus more on teaching English, and then I moved to Fresno Unified, and I taught for 3 years at a little zoo called Sequoia Junior High. And there I taught speech classes and journalism and English. And then I moved to Hoover in the fall of '67. And when I got to Hoover, what turned out to be one of my lifelong friends, Mr. Robert Darnington, in the English department there, had been doing the forensic program. And he said to me, well, with your background, you should be doing forensics. To which I responded, what is that? And that was how I got into the forensic coaching business. I diverted away from the question. Why did I focus so much on debate and extemp and speech events as opposed to interpretation events? I love interpret, I really do. And I've not been blessed with a lot of kids that could do interpret, quite frankly. And interpret, I don't think is something you can necessarily teach. I think a youngster comes to you with a natural ear, a natural sense of how a line ought to be said and how a character ought to be played. I've had, probably in 28 years of coaching, 8 or 9 kids that I thought were really outstanding natural interpreters. I've had an awful lot of kids that want to do interpret. Every freshman I get every year wants to do humorous interpret. They all think they're funny, most of them aren't. And they soon find out that they aren't funny after they go 5-5-5 in a tournament. So then I divert them into events that probably more suitably match their particular abilities or skills. Now, the other thing about interp is my philosophy has always been in coaching forensics that I'm a teacher first and a coach second. And I have to ask myself, what in what I'm teaching will be useful to this youngster 5 years from now, 4 years from now in college, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. And so I've gravitated towards focusing on the public address, the debate events, the speech and debate events, as opposed to interp, simply because I have hundreds of kids that have come back to me that have competed in debate, Lincoln Notes debate, oratory and extent, and they have universally told me that that experience in high school was the single most important thing that they did all through their high school career, that they learned more in that class that was of value to them when they got to college, when they went on in real life, that I can count, that I know of. I have 31 practicing attorneys out there, and I know several more in law school. I'm not really sure whether that's a good or bad thing, but
these days.
They will almost all universally tell you. And I've, you know, the kids that I've had in interp have all come back and said it was a wonderful experience. I had a good time. You know, I enjoyed doing that. But none of them have ever said to me, I owe my experience in life and what I'm doing as a success in my profession to interp. I only have one. I do have one that is a success. I believe she's still doing it. And the last I knew, a young lady who was a state finalist for me in dramatic interp was the director of the Denver Community Theater. And so at least one of the interpreters turned out to have some applicability in terms of what you learned in high school to do that. But the point has always been to me that I need to think in terms of the future and not towards the immediate goal of some kid winning a trophy in a contest situation. So it's never been the point. You know, I always assumed that if I taught you well enough, the skills that you learned essentially were applicable throughout your life, and the plastic trophy was just sort of a nice little thing you had that your mother had to dust. You probably went to a garage somewhere after you graduated from high school and more than likely got thrown away sooner or later.
Now let's go back to the beginning of your coaching in California. Let me ask you, who do you remember from those early tournaments?
All of them.
No, I don't mean which tournament. I mean some of the coaches that were prominent at that time in California.
Well, as I walked into forensic coaching totally ignorant, and the first state tournament that I went to, I had no idea what was going on. It was not until several tournaments later that I got designated to be an area chairperson at one state council. So the first few tournaments, I just went dutifully and sat in the judging house and went out and judged the rounds they sent me to do, and complained about the fact that the tournament never ran on time and didn't know what the heck they were doing back there. And the food was lousy and the hours were awful, and they were screwing my kids, I was sure. And I think the person that really stands out in my mind early in my career, and I'll always be thankful, I met a man named David Dansky from Richmond Kennedy High School at the University of San Francisco Invitational Tournament. And David took an interest in me because I was coaching a young man who I'd inherited from Bob Jarnigan, the previous coach, a young man who was an outstanding orator. And David had had this young man in some kind of leadership camp during the summer. So David began sort of mentoring me in terms of what forensics was all about and how to survive state tournaments and how to deal with invitational tournaments and that kind of thing. So David probably is the first person I remember that gave me a tremendous amount of help as an experienced coach. That is not to say the coaches I had in the Fresno area, the experienced coaches in the Fresno area, Dick Beers, Bob Jones, Larry Mendez, weren't a great help. I was lucky to fall into an area around Fresno where there were very experienced coaches, and the nice thing about it is we were all friends. We not only went to tournaments and worked together, but we hosted quite a few drinks together also, and
had some pretty interesting times, fishing trips together and that kind of thing. And I learned an awfully lot from them right at the outset. And then I was also blessed with some of the most outstanding kids I had early on. And I got them as sophomores, so they were my kids. And two of them were the first ones that took me to a national tournament in 1971, basically 3 years after I started coaching. And one of them turned out to be a national champion in oratory. They went in debate, and he was the second event entry in oratory. And at that time, the state champion got to come in oratory, and only first place in the district tournament. And as you remember, our district, the Central California district, was extremely competitive. And we took second in oratory at the district and didn't get to go to the national tournament, and Larry took second in the state and didn't get to go to the national tournament. And the very same thing had happened to a young man the year before. Unfortunately, you could enter oratory as a second event. You could enter the main events as a second event and work your way up into the real contest at the national tournament at Stanford in '71. And he went straight through the tournament with ones all the way through. He took one, what's called a down, and he got a 3 in a panel of 5, somewhere mid-range in the tournament. But he went all the way through the tournament, and the final round of oratory, 7 judges for 7 months.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. That really is.
Well, I mean,
you
sort of
worked in
instant
tab
kind of
before,
thing,
you know, that's...
I didn't, you know, as far as Larry's speech and ability,
No, I'm going to stop you for just a second.
I didn't do
Larry
that.
who?
Larry Artine was his name.
Okay, I just think that it's good to have that.
He's now a professor. He's teaching law at the San Joaquin College of Law in Fresno.
Terrific. Where was the first state tournament that you went to?
First state tournament?
Well, the first state tournament, I went with Bob Jarnigan as assistant coach. As I say, I was sort of the flunky assistant coach for a year. And so Bob and I went to LA State, the very first state tournament. Los Angeles State College up on a mountaintop, I remember that. I don't remember a whole lot about the tournament because the whole thing was not only confusing but pretty awe-inspiring. I know I just got sent out to judge rounds.
Right.
Had the usual trouble with rookie coach finding the right building at the right time and knowing where I was supposed to be at the right time. So I don't have any real impression of that tournament except that some of our kids did all right and the others didn't. We took second in oratory that year too, a young man named Mike North, who was one of Bob's kids, and couldn't get him to the national tournament either. He was a hands-down national champion.
Isn't it, I always think it's interesting in talking to people with experience that when we started out and went to our first state tournaments, we went through the very same thing that the young coaches go through now from the standpoint of what's happening, where are we supposed to be?
There's always a big, well, I think what happens, you come from your little local league tournaments and you're used to being at the center of the action. You're in the tab room, you know what's happening all the time. And obviously at the state tournament, when you've got 140 or 160 schools involved and now upwards of 1,000 students, you can't have everybody traipsing through the tab room. And remember a few years back we started publishing, putting out for coaches inspection the results after rounds, because there is a certain amount of paranoia when you're sitting out there as a young coach and you don't know what's going on and you can't see what's going on and nobody's telling you what's going on. I think coaches have to learn that you've got to avail yourself of the opportunity to review the results, not only to check the people in the tab rooms for mistakes, but also just to solve your own sense of curiosity as to what's going on. I don't know whether it does you any good or not in terms of coaching your kids. But the first few state tournaments I went to, I was completely unaware of what was happening. And then the first tournament where I got to be something on the inside, I think, was at the University of San Francisco. And that had to be 70, I don't remember what year it was now, 73 or 74. And Murray and Mendez and Beers and Jones came out and said, I was assigning judges, probably the least desired job, the most thankless job at the state tournament. I was assigning judges at the USF tournament, and they said, you've just been elected to the area chairperson. I had no idea
what you were elected to.
I didn't know. I have any idea. I just knew that, okay, what does that mean? And they said, well, you have to go to meetings with us and drink a lot of booze and listen to a lot of boring coaches talk at meetings. So, okay, I can do that. And that's how I got to be area chairman. And I found out what it all meant shortly thereafter. I I'm not sure the sequence, but I believe it was the next year we were at UCLA.
Could have been. I can't remember the sequences.
I was assigning judges at that tournament also, and it was not a good task. At UCLA, they had the judges down in the student center, but all the contest rooms were up on the hill.
5 miles away.
Royce Square was all out there. And so we were losing 20 minutes around in just walk time, contestants and judges walking back and forth. Well, came something like 10 o'clock at night. We had a debate round to get out, and I'm looking at a clean judge room. There's not a body sitting there. I need 6 judges for a quarterfinal round debate. So what am I going to do? So I ran downstairs, I jumped to my station wagon, and went over to the Holiday Inn, the round Holiday Inn by the 405 freeway, where half the tournament was staying, or maybe all the tournament at that time. And I went up to the top floor to the bar, and I found a very large table with a considerable number of judges who apparently had been there quite some time, coaches. And so I invited them to a party, which they were readily willing to go. And I took them all down, loaded them in my station wagon, and drove them back to the student centers, handed them all the ballots, and the party starts right after the debate round's over. And
that's the first time I've heard
they
that
didn't have much of
story.
a choice at that point. They were 4 miles away from the hotel, so what the heck? They went and judged, and they came back, and I did. I took them back up, and I bought them all 4 or 5 rounds of drinks. But we got through the quarterfinal round debate.
I had not heard that one before, Larry. All right, now, 20-some years ago, you started in speech, and you soon after got involved with the State Speech Council. What's changed? What's good, what's bad, do you think, in change?
Well, for years, as I said, I'm an educator, I'm a coach. And I thought that our focus in the first few years I was on the council was we spent all of our time dithering around with rule changes and rules and adding events and taking events away. And the entire focus was on forensic competition. And that was all well and good. I mean, that's obviously one of the primary things we're in business for, but I didn't think we were doing very much in terms of providing any kind of curriculum support for teachers, speech teachers, beginning coaches, English teachers who might want to do speech things. And so I think probably the most encouraging and I think the most important thing that we've done the past few years is to do a considerable amount of work with curriculum materials and to start providing curriculum materials. And we have an ongoing effort to provide curriculum materials. At this point in time, you know that we're working on providing a handbook that a rookie coach like I was in 1968 could pick up and get some sense of what the whole thing is about and how you coach the events. And nobody ever handed any of that to any of us. And if you didn't come through a forensic program in college as your experience, and you walked into the job like I did, and I've seen a lot of coaches over the years who walked in and walked back out a couple of years later because there wasn't any curriculum support for them. And I think that's probably the most important thing we've done. And I think the other thing we've learned, maybe in terms of growth and size, we've learned that maybe we've made the thing a little too big as far as the state tournament is concerned. On the other hand, we have more kids involved than we ever had before. So I like the growth in the tournament. I'm not sure we haven't outgrown ourselves in terms of what we can handle the state tournament, but I like having a lot of kids have the opportunity to come to the state tournament. When I started, we didn't have nearly as many individual events. Of course, we didn't have Lincoln Douglas debate. Congress is sort of a minuscule backwater event that didn't get much. It's kind of the Rodney Dangerfield of events. You know, nobody wanted to be in Congress, but that was the only way to get the state tournament you came. And I think we've done a lot to make the state tournament a good educational experience for a kid, regardless of whether or not he's a coach.
Now, this is sometimes the hardest question to answer of all, Larry, because I know you don't like to talk about yourself.
You know,
What do you feel are the most important things that you have contributed to speech in California?
Well, I don't know. I don't like to thump my own tub. I like to stay on top of things, and probably as an English teacher, I'm something of a frustrated writer, and I don't have time to write stuff, you know, to get published in learned journals and that kind of thing. But I have contributed a considerable number of articles to the State Speech Bulletin, which I hope have proven useful or interesting to a lot of coaches. I've contributed a lot of articles to the rostrum over the years. The things that I think about that people need to know or need to learn about as far as coaching, be of interest to coaches only, certainly not to anybody else, most of it. But I've tried to make that contribution. I think probably the thing that I'm most proud of is 2 courses of study that I've written. I banged my head against the University of California for 20 years. They would not recognize speech classes for English credit, which meant that when I started coaching, you could take a year of public speaking for English credit. You could take 4 years of forensic for English credit, and then UC clamped down and decided that somehow or another forensic instruction did not equate to English instruction and what they wanted. And so they stopped giving credit, at least for Fresno Unified. They wouldn't recognize our forensic class or our speech classes. And I banged my head against that for years, and I wrote all kind of hostile letters. And finally, through fortuitous circumstances, I finally met the lady at the University of California who I'd tilted with all these years, and we had a nice evening's chat in San Diego at a state council meeting, which cost a considerable amount of money because I bought dinner and wine and all those things, and we had a nice talk. And I had submitted a course of study for forensics, and it precisely met the State of California Department of Education framework and guidelines, and the University of California accepted that course for 1 year of English credit. And the very next year I took our old public speaking course of study in Fresno Unified and rewrote that, and it is now accepted for a year of English credit by the University of California, which basically means that the state universities also accept it. I had an interesting conversation on the way up here with one of my students who's going to the Air Force Academy, and he's a water polo player, and I guess I have to go back and tilt with the NCAA, because the NCAA says, interestingly enough, that he took a semester of rhetoric and oral communication, and they're not going to count that. The NCAA says that doesn't count for a year of English, although they would count a year of public speaking for English.
Isn't that interesting?
And so my guess is that nobody at the NCAA knows what the hell rhetoric means,
Right.
or oral communication means, and so our counselors, I guess, are in the process of trying to educate the NCAA that this course is accepted by the University of California for English credit. Certainly the NCAA shouldn't second-guess the University of California.
Now, anything, I mean, this is difficult to do all of the, off the cuff here, but anything that, any tournament, any incident, any kid, anything that you really, really, really is memorable that you'd like to share?
I'm going to put it all in my book.
This is not going to be an advertisement.
Well, actually, most of these stories, I have a lot of anecdotes about things that happened that's going to appear in the State Speech Bulletin this spring. And these are things that happened when I happened to be in charge of the state tournament. Probably the most interesting story of all was at the state tournament in San Diego one year. I was the president, and the president, as you know, having been president, doesn't have much to do with the state tournament. So I was standing around trying to look presidential and you know, basically public relations, and pat people on the back and talk to them and calm their nerves and answer questions, when someone came to me and said, "You need to get down to such and such room, that there are a whole bunch of women coaches down there screaming at each other about throwing a selection out of the tournament, and that there's an attorney there, a female attorney, who says that if they throw this selection out of the tournament, that she's going to get an injunction to stop the whole state tournament." Well, okay, I'll wait. So sure enough, I walked down this room, and here are all these women screeching at one another. The title of the selection was from a National Lampoon piece, and it was called "My Penis." And the very basic premise of the story is that, I mean, it's just kind of funny, it's in bad taste, but the premise of the story is that a 16-year-old girl wakes up one morning and she's grown this thing, this penis, and she's not sure what to do with it. So the ladies who were offended by this and thought it shouldn't be in the tournament were screeching at the coach, and I walked in and I said, "Excuse me, could you tell me who the attorney is here?" And this very petite, pretty lady said, "I am." And I said, "Would you step outside?" And I said, "What is the problem here?" She says, "Well, they're saying they're going to have this thrown out." And I said, "Well, I don't think that's going to happen." I said, "What is your name?" And she said, "I'm Gloria Allred." Well, for those who don't know, Gloria Allred is probably the leading feminist attorney in the United States. I mean, I'm in way over my head here. So I said, "Well, Miss Allred, I have a cover sheet on that selection which says it's signed by the coach, it's signed by the student, it's signed by the principal, which tells me that that basically is community standard." And I said, "We don't censor anything, any speech, any selection at the state tournament." I said, "We don't have the power to do that, nor would I do that in this case." I said, "My penis will stand or fall on its own merit." And she laughed about that and said that's fine with me, and that was the end of the controversy.
This is one story.
Yeah, I have sat with Larry and heard him tell about some of his experiences and things, which I really do hope you're publishing a book, because I think at least every speech teacher in the United States would find it.
Well, I'm sure that there are others that have thousands of stories. I mean, all of us do. We have had adventures and misadventures with our kids that are beyond belief. I remember driving back.
This was the first time I ever took the kids to an invitational all by myself. We went to the University of San Francisco Invitational. It was a very rainy year. It was 1969. And we got out of San Francisco very late, and I had to make a lot of detours coming back because creeks were out of their banks and irrigation ditches were running. So we were running very late coming back into Fresno. And it was around 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'm approaching the little town of Madera, which is about 20 miles north of Fresno, and the gas gauge has read E for quite some time. So I found this station on the north end of, by the highway on the north end of Madera, and it was the Rocket gas station, and it had an old, like a model of a V-2 rocket stuck up on the roof, and it was open. So I pulled in there, and the kids were all tired of riding and grumpy and waking up at that time. You know, you never drive anywhere late at night as a forensic coach with anybody to talk to, so they'd been asleep. And they woke up, and we pulled in the Rocket gas station, and a little old hunchback man came out, and he didn't say a word. He was somewhere, I would say, in his late 60s, early 70s. And I said, "I'd like $5 worth of gas." And this is when they actually came out and pumped the gas in your car. It wasn't a self-serve thing. So in the meantime, one of my students had gotten out, and he'd walked over to one of those old-fashioned soda coolers, which had the bottles, and you lift up the lid, and the bottles are all hanging in a rack in rows, and you have to slide one down, put your money in, and pull it out. And he said, "Smith, you better come over here and look at this." Well, I went over and looked, and the only sodas that were in that cooler were sodas that were Dixie Cola and Snark, S-N-A-R-K. I thought, this is strange. So I paid the $5 to the little man, and we all got back in the car. He never said a word to us, and we drove on to Fresno. And about 2 months later, we had to go north to a tournament, to a district tournament, Sacramento, Stockton, somewhere. And so we told about the Dixie Cola and the Rocket gas station and the little Quasimodo man that had been running the place to all the other kids, and of course they wanted to see it. So as we drove north and we came to the north side of Madera, much to our surprise, it's sort of a Rod Serling thing, there was no Rocket gas station there, none whatsoever. I mean, you know, do sort of thing. And I don't know where it became the Rocket gas station, but it certainly did disappear in that 2 months' time. And then, you know, you just have all kind of things like that happen to you. That's, you know, any young coach that ever happens to look at this thing, you just got a lot of adventures coming in your life, and some of them aren't going to be any fun, but they'll all be interesting.
Mm-hmm. You better believe it. One last question.
Okay.
Some years ago, you predicted the demise of this organization.
Yes, I did.
By the year 2000.
Yes, I did.
Are we going to make it, or are we going to go beyond?
Well, I'm still not sure. What I see is that the organization, at that time, what had happened was that Proposition 13 passed. And that was going to take a lot of potential funding away, the property tax funding from school districts. And you know that when school districts start cutting back things, the first thing they cut are frivolous things to school board members. Certainly never football, but things like art and music and drama and speech all go away. And this was really happening over the next 2 or 3 years, that a lot of school districts dropped programs because they were running out of funding, and this was before the state legislature began to bail the schools out with more money. I think now, probably, at least in some respects, California High School Speech Association is going to survive into the next century unless something really drastic happens with educational funding in the state. I hope it grows. In my 28 years at this, we have essentially stayed pretty much the same in terms of total number of schools that are members. There are probably now in excess of 1,500 or 1,600 high schools in the state. And we're running a membership that runs somewhere around 260 to 300 schools a year. And to me, it's too bad that we can't get more schools involved. But I think that we probably will survive. And I think one of the things that will make us survive is not so much because we have a state tournament every year. I think the thing that would make California High School Speech Association and speech communication instruction in general go on in this state is that we get the curriculum to the point where people understand what it really is, and that is, it is a curriculum that is essential to everybody. And I think the day the school districts begin to understand that oral communication is important to people's survival and their life and their success, that CHSSA will be assured of a future forever. I don't know when that's ever going to happen. It's certainly not happening rapidly, but I think we will last past 2000.
Thanks, Larry.
Okay.
I really appreciate your coming and
Well, it was fun.
bearing your soul here. You have so many more stories. We could go on for 2, 3, 4 more hours, but
Yeah.
you gave us some really nice insights. I appreciate that, Larry.
Okay.